Hello, my name is Morgan Freeman, and this is the story of Jenkins the lowly office worker, human resource cowboy, Mr. Greensuit, and Johnson the shady office worker. We begin our day in the office, just another regular sunny day. Here we have our protagonist, Jenkins, coming into work all happy. Jenkins sits down with his morning coffee, as usual, when suddenly he notices... In comes Mr. Greensuit, Jenkins' very verbally abusive boss. Jenkins screams in terror at the sight of his boss, as usual. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the office, Human Resource Cowboy is taking a nap. Mr. Greensuit yells at Jenkins that he must find a very important file for the office today. Jenkins, as usual, is cowering in fear, but heeds his request. Mr. Greensuit leaves the office room, shouting, as usual, just random shouting. Meanwhile, Human Resource Cowboy senses a disturbance in the office and wakes up. 2 hours have passed, and Jenkins has yet to find the file. Jenkins decides that the file must be in a different place in the office, and so he runs. He runs and he runs until he comes across Johnson, the shady office worker. Jenkins begs Johnson to help him find the important file. Johnson thinks for a minute, being all shady and stuff. He tells Jenkins of a room on the other side of the office, filled with files, and it must be there. Jenkins expresses his gratitude towards Johnson and makes his way to the other side of the office. Jenkins finds the room that Johnson was talking about, only to find that it is a room scattered with files. Literally millions of files. After 5 hours of searching, Jenkins finally accepts defeat. Jenkins reports his failure to Mr. Greensuit, who is absolutely angry. Jenkins has no choice but to take the intense verbal abuse. Mr. Greensuit leaves Jenkins to his failure. When it is revealed that Human Resource Cowboy was behind the door the whole time. Human Resource Cowboy introduces himself to the distraught Jenkins and lets Jenkins know that everything is going to be alright and that he will find the file.
Our story begins with a simple meeting between two powerful men, one that would change the lives of their lessers dramatically.
This is the Jenkins File.
After recent events, the Office King and Mr. Greensuit had no choice but to find other methods of motivating their employees. They called a meeting, exchanged pleasantries, and began their discussion. The Office King was the first to come up with a plan. He was a straightforward man, hardened by the events of the Ice Cream War. If there was one thing that he learned during the conflict, it was that the best solution was often the most direct one. It was no surprise, then, that his suggestion was to simply yell at the employees, to bully them into submission. Mr. Greensuit knew this would be his answer. This was one reason he liked the Office King. He always spoke his mind directly, even if it would endanger his position in the company. Mr. Greensuit, however, always played by the book. His role in the office demanded it. Because of this, he would never openly agree to the King's plan, but he wouldn't necessarily stop it either. Meanwhile, Jenkins continued his search for the missing file. He knew very well that his job was on the line, and so he wasted no time. He began to sweep the office, looking through every file cabinet that he could find. It was during this search that the Office King put his plan into action. While Jenkins searched through the file cabinet in his co-worker Johnson's room, the King suddenly burst through the door. Without hesitation, he began to unleash hell on the two employees. Jenkins found himself rooted to the spot, as all manner of profanity and death threats poured from the King's mouth. Johnson was no better off. As the King continued his assault, Johnson began to slip away, obviously recalling some horrifying incident from the Ice Cream War. Eventually, the king ended his tirade and walked away, leaving behind him the human resources cowboy, who was just as shocked and disoriented as the two employees before him. As he began to comfort Johnson, Jenkins slipped from the room. The HR cowboy would need time to help Johnson, and the file was clearly not in this room. At least, that was what he thought. Returning to his office, Jenkins was determined to find the file. After the incident that just occurred, he knew the clock was ticking. He began to rifle through the remnants of the office's online database. It was mostly junk, as he expected, but there was one interesting piece of information. He uncovered records of a room that was used to store all manner of old files, some dating back to a time before the war itself. It was a long shot, but it was also his only shot. Without hesitation, he set off towards that room. Luck was not on his side, however. The room he found himself in was an absolute wreck. Papers covered the floor from wall to wall, with no apparent order whatsoever. Jenkins had no choice but to look, however. His job depended on it. And so, with this in mind, he sat down and began to search. The search was short-lived, however. As Jenkins combed the room for the file, Mr. Greensuit, the office king, and HR cowboy entered the room. Obviously, the room was not always in such disarray, as the two executives were absolutely furious. They instantly blamed Jenkins for everything, from the file's disappearance to the chaotic state that the file room was in. Jenkins couldn't help but stare at them, terrified. He knew this was the end. The job he had worked so hard for was about to be ripped from him, and for reasons he didn't fully understand. It was then that Mr. Greensuit uttered the two words that no employee ever wanted to hear. "You're fired."
Hello, this is Morgan Freeman. No relation. When we last left Jenkins, he was recently fired for not finding a file that he spent the entire day looking for. Overcome with sadness and depression, he was on his way out of the office in a walk of shame. For most, the story would be over by now. But for others, the workday continues, with questions that need answers. Johnson approached Mr. Greensuit, claiming that he has found the file that Jenkins could not. Mr. Greensuit, suspicious of these claims, had to examine the file carefully. With confirmation that this was the correct file, Mr. Greensuit was overjoyed and quickly gave Johnson a promotion. Jenkins was shocked at the turn of events, but he was even more shocked when Johnson approached him and told him that he had the file the entire time. The only question that Jenkins had on his mind at this time was, why would Johnson do this to him? The answer lies in Johnson's past. One day during the ice cream war, Johnson was waiting for his daily ice cream rations. Jenkins was running late, as usual. Jenkins asked Johnson if he could cut in line, but while Johnson was explaining that he was waiting in line for a long time, Jenkins cut in front of him anyway. Jenkins got his ice cream, but when it was Johnson's turn, he did not. This is where Johnson's war flashbacks stem from, and this is where Johnson started planning his revenge. Ever since that day, it became Johnson's mission to ruin Jenkins's life. Today, he accomplished that mission. Before Jenkins could respond, Office King yelled at him. Among other things, he told Jenkins to get his sorry butt out of his office. And thus, Jenkins continued his walk of shame. How much can a man lose in one day? He can lose his job. He can lose his friends. But what else is there? This robot can answer that question. Cold, harsh, and calculating. Without hesitation, the robot killed Jenkins right on the spot. How much can a man lose in one day? He can lose his job. He can lose his friends. And he can lose his life. This has been the Jenkins File.
Jenkins cried, Jenkins died, Jenkins lost his pride. The file he could not find that could have saved his life is the reason that he is dead.